And third, I will try to list a few reasons why evaluation is more on the map than it has been the case before. And fourth, and this is part of the conversation that I have had over the years with UR, fourth, the future of evaluation and maybe what would be needed, which is not necessarily happening now, for evaluation as a way to make it more of a relevant field. So, first point, a bit of definition for evaluation. The first thing that I think you are and Raoul would tell you about evaluation is that it has to be distinguished from monitoring. Evaluation entails a monitoring dimension, that is to say, entails trying to follow what's happening in terms of the implementation of policies, but evaluation, although it's often the case, shouldn't be identified with or reduced to monitoring, because in the end evaluation is essentially about assessing whether or not the formulation or conceptualization of policy or policies and the implementation of policy or of policies is creating, first of all, or is delivering what it is supposed to deliver, two, optimizing resources allocated, and three, in the end, creating added value. So I think that evaluation essentially, what it entails, monitoring dimension, is more than this. It's about assessing whether or not what is planned to be done is happening, whether or not what this is supposed to happen is creating optimization of resources, and three, creating added value. I guess that would be, as a non-specialist, my definition of evaluation. So that's the first point that I wanted to make. The second one has to do with the fact that up to recently, evaluation wasn't taken seriously, at least at the international level. Of course, you know, the practice of evaluation of public policies has been with us for a long time in developed countries, in the context of which you have a functioning state, in the context of which allocation of resources and use of resources is a major concern. But at the international level, in fact, I think it's only recently that evaluation has been, was turned to become a semi-booming business. And I'll give you the example of ODA. ODA, as you know, is the practice of official development assistance, and it's what developed countries are allocating as a way to help and boost the development. And one would, and of course, quite a bit of money over the years have been allocated in this area by rich countries. And one would think that because it is really, you know, handled by the OECD, because it is handled by countries which have the institutional resources to really assess whether or not the money allocated is well spent, one would think that in fact ODA has been dovetailed over the years with seriousness in terms of evaluating whether or not this money is being well spent. And the truth of the matter is that it's not the case. It's not the case, not simply because we don't have the means to do it, but I think essentially because the interest of member states allocating resources in the field of development assistance has not been geared towards evaluating whether or not this money is creating added value, whether or not this money is optimizing the resources allocated, whether or not this money is fulfilling the mandate put forward. And just for the reference, for your reference, if you're interested in this, I just published a few weeks ago an article entitled "Nationally Based Data: Challenges for Global Governance and Global Policy," which is all about trying to think about data in the context of global policy. And one of the examples that I take with my co-author, Ibrahim Tari, who is from the New School University, formerly the New School of Social Research, is precisely ODA. And in the context of this article, we make the case that in fact, even though ODA has been with us for many, many decades, it's only recently that the evaluation of ODA has been really a priority for the OECD and developed countries, and still it is far from being satisfactory in terms of practice and in terms of theory. So all this to say that even though at the national level for developed countries evaluation has been taken seriously, at the international level it's not the case historically, and the ODA example tells us that in fact surprisingly even in this area concerns for evaluation and seriousness haven't been really at the forefront. So therefore my third point is why is it that it's not the case any longer? Why is it that evaluation is now really on the rise throughout international organizations and you know, in the UN context, among other things? I think that there are, let's see, I think that there are three reasons that we can think about in terms of accounting for this change of landscape and this growing interest and attention given to evaluation issues. The first one is the fact that there is less resources, less money available at the national level, especially money geared towards development activities. It's perhaps less the case when it comes to the environment, but when it comes to development, it seems that there is a scarcity of resources, and therefore with scarcity of resources comes the idea that we should perhaps be mindful of the ways through which we spend this money and what we generate out of this money being spent. And this is all the more the case considering that with scarcity of resources at the national level, considering that money floating around in international organizations come from the national level, there is by definition less money available at the international level, right? So that's the first reason. Scarcity of resources bring about great awareness for the need to look into how the money is being spent and whether or not it's fulfilling what it is supposed to fulfill. Okay, the second reason I think is an ideological one. For a number of years, decades, in fact, the public sector and public allocation of public resources, including public money, is under stress simply because the view is that it is not properly handled, and whatever goes through the state in developed countries and in developing countries is destined prone to be mishandled. And I think that there is pressure being exercised on the public sector at the national level as well as at the international level for featuring, for displaying the fact that yes, this money is being well spent. So out of an ideological commitment, if you will, to liberal or neoliberal policies, as a response to this, the national sector at the national and the public sector at the national and international levels are quite eager to demonstrate that in fact, you know, this money is being well spent, and we're in fact eager to find ways to spend this money better and better. I think that's a second factor. And the third factor, I think, has to do with the evolution which leads us to go from global governance to global policy. 10 years ago, when we talked about international organizations, international institutions, the World Bank, the UN, and so on, and the relationship of these institutions with the governments, we were essentially talking about global governance, right? A loose network of affiliated institutions and agencies, right? Now I think that there is a move towards global policy. And when we move from global governance to global policy, in fact, we are more in the business of trying to understand what would be the mechanism, the institutions, the resources required for the translation of norms and mechanisms of global policy, of global governance, into mechanisms and realities of global policy. And I think this entails partly, you know, putting evaluation front and center. So I tend to think that the fact that evaluation is becoming more central than it was the case in the past has also to do with this evolution from global governance to global policy. In fact, one of the illustrations of this reality is that in the context of the European Union, which is an exercise of public policy at the regional level, historically, evaluation has always been very, very important, all the way to the, at least more than at the global level, all the way from I used to work for the European Union, and in the 90s, you know, it was already important, right? And partly because, in fact, the European Union is itself an outgrowth of national polities themselves committed to public goods, public institutions, and therefore there is a match here, right? So that's, I think, a bit the rationale that we have to find in evaluation becoming more important than in the past. Fourth point, the future. So both Raoul and it's my conclusion, that is to say the way forward. Both Raoul and you are among the best, I mean, best practitioners in the field of evaluation, and yourself also too, of course. But I happen to have known Raoul and Johan for many years. So so when I talk with them, you know, this is always the nitty-gritty and the technical dimension of the field which comes to the fore, right? And of course, not knowing much about evaluation and being myself more interested in theoretical issues and global policy issues, I tend to think that unless for the way forward we articulate better the relationship between a technical and inside-looking approach of evaluation with, you know, the big picture issues of development paradigms, issues of economic paradigms, there is the risk that, in fact, evaluations would serve as a caution for overall bad policies. In the end, when you think about evaluation, you have to think that evaluation carries a normative message, which has to do with effectiveness, with fairness, with accountability, with transparency. And these norms, these values, are both values of technical dimension, having to do with, you know, good policies in the field of development economics, but also with you know, principles and so on, right? And I think it's quite difficult to theorize and practice this normative dimension which is entailed in evaluation from a technical point of view as an island of good practice if it is, you know, floating around in an ocean of bad practices. So I think that the future and the happy future of evaluation as a professional field will have to do with better articulating the relationship between the small picture, the technical picture, and the big picture. So that's it for Foley. Thank you.
We'll move to the next speaker, and we'll save questions to the end due to the nature of train schedules. So,
yes. I think Jean-Marc's introduction was so good that, you know, we should just stop here and
go home.
Discussion
Yes.
It was quite good. So Chandi will speak a little bit more about evaluation, as we've just heard in the introduction, regarding the UN.
Thank you. And I apologize that I'm going to talk and run. But as was said earlier, I'm from UNDP. Yuha actually is my supervisor, so it's like being at a seminar with the professor looking on. One realizes even if one's 58 years old, you're still in a seminar. But what I'd like to do, if you can shift to the next one, is briefly go through it, and what your introduction is a perfect takeoff to a more internal look at what monitoring and evaluation is like within the UN. So I'd like to briefly tell you what evaluation is in the UN, go through definitions more written out, so you get a sense of what Professor Kwaku said was the distinguishing factors between monitoring and evaluation. Then talk about the architecture of evaluation within the whole UN system a little bit briefly, and just a few thoughts on what that means in terms of the placement of the function within an organization, because the UN is a vast number of agencies and funds and programs, and the Secretariat, where my former colleague Rahul used to work, where I used to work as well. And just a few issues that I, as a fairly long in the tooth staff member of the UN, have come to experience being involved in monitoring and evaluation. And I should preface my statement by saying I started off as a program person, more involved in monitoring, and I graduated to evaluation because I wanted to know how the story ended. if that was really the compelling reason, was I'd done so much to get a project approved, so then what? And it's a different branch of the endeavor. So let me start by talking about a brief couple of points. Next slide, please. Evaluation at the UN really can trace its formal roots back to the early 1980s. And certainly the first evaluation office of UNDP was set up in 1981-82. I remember distinctly when it was set up, which means a budget was allocated for evaluation in the executive board. That's an important point to make. We also set up at that point in UNDP an interagency working group, which spread the tentacles out on evaluation to other agencies of the UN, like WHO, UNIDO, all these agencies that used UNDP money to deliver their products. So we had an interagency working group of evaluation officers that began to spring up in the early 80s all over the UN stage. Coincidentally, it was interesting to me as I put this timeline together, when did the American Evaluation Association set itself up? 1986. So obviously the 80s were a time that there was interest in looking at what does this money lead to in terms of effects and impacts. The Interagency Working Group was renamed the United Nations Evaluation Group. You can see it's getting more grand sounding in its name. It's now the United Nations Evaluation Group. And the big watershed for us was that in 2005, modeled very much on the DAC OECD guidelines, the UN adapted and set up norms and standards for evaluation. And they're available on the www.uneval.org should you ever want to take a look. But it does give you a sense of what are the principles, etc., that govern this practice. If you look, the next one is the definition of evaluation. I won't go through it, but the mantra for us is you have to look at relevance. It's a judgment, okay? So it's just not, it's something where you have to weigh the pros and cons and make a determination. It's a judgment of relevance, appropriateness, effectiveness, efficiency, impact, and sustainability of development efforts. So those are the criteria by which we judge any of the efforts that we are going to look at. It's supposed to be rigorous, meaning we use data, evidence. It's systematic and objective. Very important, that objectivity. And we're trying to see what works and why, highlight intended and unintended results, and come up with strategic lessons that will help guide future decisions. That's evaluation in a nutshell. Monitoring, on the other hand, is a continuous function. It's done by those involved in the process, and it is an opportunity to really take stock every so often and say, are we on the right path? Should we be, and we use terms like theory of change, logical frameworks, all of that. It's a critical input to evaluation, but it's done by different people who are not required to be objective. I mean, they should be self-critical, but certainly it's not required that they be as objective as evaluators, and independent. That's an important form that we do rather treasure, is the independence of the evaluation function. And I would like to go to the architecture in the UN system. There are variations in the placement of the evaluation function based on what it's concerned with. So there are 10 of the 25 agencies that this particular report looked at, which is pretty much the bulk of the UN agencies. 10 are standalone, meaning they're independent evaluation units. 9 are co-located with oversight, very often with audit and investigation. Rahul comes from that branch. 6 are co-located with management. Very often that's a symptom of size and ability to put resources into the subject, but something as large as the UN High Commissioner for Refugees is co-located with management. So interesting variations on the theme. because in UNHCR they see the evaluation function is almost like a little think tank to the High Commissioner. He wants to know about something, he dispatches his evaluators for an objective assessment. So that's the variations, and the placement does give you variations on the spectrum from monitoring to evaluation. The effects of placement, which is my next slide, is that when independent, management tends to obviously see us quite suspiciously. So when you're out there, they tend to, as I put here, they drown you in documentation. You know, you go in there and say, we want to, they just dump it all at you and say, go ahead, have fun. They are very guarded in their responses. They are very aware that you're just one step away from an audit in your. They focus on the financials. They look at the conformity with rules. Have you looked at their mandate here? And they always question whether the method that we are using is a good method or not. And they will. So that's one effect of being an evaluation function that's very independent. When it's with program planning and monitoring, we are pulled in various directions. And there's no clear identity, and possibly you're one of the boys, and I should be gender sensitive when I say boys or girls. But in that sense, you're somewhat pulled into. The other thing that's really important to look at when you look at an evaluation function is to see where it is placed, to whom is it accountable. If it is accountable to senior management, not as good as, say, in the World Bank or where it's accountable directly to the board of directors. UNDP, we are accountable to the executive board. That helps to preserve the independence of the function. The other signal is the type and volume of resources that you do get. The UN Secretariat, when I was last there, and Rahul may say it has changed, has no specific budget category for evaluation. So, I mean, we have a budget for the evaluation, but within our programs, there is no evaluation line. UN funds and programs have a better record of putting money aside. And there's always a debate. What percentage of your program should you put aside for monitoring and evaluation? There's 1%, 5%. The sort of people have settled on 3%, 1 to 3%. But those are all indicators that you look at to look at what type of evaluation office are we dealing with. My last point, which might be of interest to you, is so who are these people called evaluators? You know, we're not geographers, we are not, and it's always been a bit of a dilemma. The UN Evaluation Group job description template for evaluation officers calls for an advanced university degree in business, public administration, economics, or other relevant advanced degree. That's literally, so it's a pretty broad category. But I think it's perhaps a generic problem that you see even with the American Evaluation Association, which has as its principles that evaluation of programs, products, personnel, policy, performance, proposals, technology, research, theory, and even of evaluation itself. So I mean, it's the waterfront here. But I think we're all united by a desire to see what has happened. Was it good? Was it equitable? Was it merit and worth? Was it value for money? And there are many roads to that, to answer those questions. And so you will have that many evaluation methods to try and answer that question. In terms of a dilemma that we face on a day-to-day basis, is how do we get expert assistance to help us actually undertake these evaluations? Do we look for people who are familiar with the evaluation method, or people who are, say, I'm struggling with, at the moment, trying to put a team together for gender evaluation, which some of you are familiar with. Do I look for a poverty specialist or somebody who understands gender in a poverty? It's a very hard call. So is it a combination, ideally, of both? Knowing how to do evaluation, knowing how to use data, knowing how to pull out the story that the data tells me, and do it in a way that is defensible. That is also part of the dilemma of being in the evaluation business. So I just wanted to highlight some of these issues, taken about 8 minutes, to share with you what it's like in the internal world of the UN and at a systemic level, and to agree with Professor Kaku that the time for evaluation has arrived after all these years. It is now something that is, we are busily trying to get a UN resolution to make 2015 the year of evaluation. I frankly never thought this day would come, that it would be a topic for the General Assembly to debate and have a decision on. So it started in the 80s. It's taken a bit of time, 30, 35 years, but it has arrived and cannot be ignored. So thank you very much.
So
Yeah, sure.
Chandi, I think we might have time for one question. Would you like to field one or two short questions?
Sure,
one
definitely.
from a professor, one from a student, maybe?
Oh, let's not make it so.
Okay, then Cheyenne.
When it's advanced degrees from universities, you want a master's or a PhD?
Masters. They'd like PhDs, but we don't always. If we want a PhD, we will say that in the job description. But generally, it's master's level
And just
at the entry level.
question with that. Do you look for specializations, certain specializations in that master's, or say a master's in public policy can be anything, like master's in public policy with a concentration in international development, or with a concentration in education policy, or with something else? So do you look for such concentrations also?
From my experience, it depends on the agency you're applying to. If you're applying to UNICEF, I think it would help if you've done some work in the area of education and early, but not necessarily. Do you have a thought on that?
No, exactly. I think it's quite broad. My own studies, my background is in geography, and we have actually 3 geographers out of our 17 evaluators in our office. We have economists, we have your public
administration, but actually it's English literature.
But I think that's a good answer, really, the fact that it depends on the agency. I mean, if your agency deals with, if it's FAO, so it may help if you know something about agriculture.
But for something like UNDP, which is a multifaceted organization that does governance, poverty, gender, post-conflict environment, that we really can't afford to specialize too much. We need somebody who has good technical skills with how to look at a database, pull out the information, and be able to make data, an analysis of data, something that is key.
Can I make one short point also? Because now evaluation is becoming more and more of an academic field also, and you have a lot of places where you can get a master's or even PhD in evaluation. And I think that's really good in many ways. On the other hand, it's also kind of scary if you get a 25-year-old PhD in evaluation methodology to come and try to sort out to make sense out of what these UN programs have been doing. So with due respect, because it's also a kind of it's helpful if you have background in managing some of the stuff, like Chandi used to be a program manager, and Rahul has been working a long time in peacekeeping operations in the field and so forth. So it helps. I mean, it's good to have the methodological background, and it's good to have the educational background and the evaluative thinking, but what I mean is that it's good to also to have other kind of
human
experience.
gravity.
Yeah,
I mean,
so to say, yeah, which I have.
Yes.
Some agencies like the World Food Programme's Evaluation Office has a balance of technical people plus people who've been practitioners, so that they can work together.
Thank you.
Yes, because it's also a very social job. It's about also, interacting with people and evaluating their jobs. It's also about social skills.
It's a lot about
Yes.
social skills, and it's a lot about being able to go and tell people that actually your last 5 years were a failure, and having them to accept it.
Yeah, you know, you want them to be open without being threatened.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Which is not easy.
Yeah, it's not your fault, but you know, but actually,
yes.
actually you did a really
Terrible
great
job.
job.
Yes.
And your
Yeah, it's a
program.
very tough job.
Yeah.
And I think what has helped me is having to bring up children.
Yeah.
Because it's the same thing. You cannot absolutely tell people you suck. You know.
Although we like to do that.
But you he does it very well. No, but it is to be able to give a message in a balanced way. There was this amount of effort, but
Yeah.
gosh, you're way off the mark.
Yeah.
It is a very, very.
In a way, you are teachers.
In a
Well,
way.
you're learning both ways because you have a perspective, but you didn't live it.
Mhm.
You know, you didn't live that experience that they tried to deal with corruption, but it was at a higher level than they could deal with.
Okay, excellent.
Can I ask a quick question?
Oh, sure.
So based on the overall sentiment, it sounds like you face more challenges than you've received successes, based on everyone's attitude on what you're sharing about, oh, you suck, and you tried, but you missed. Oops. Is that the norm for the evaluations that you're finding, or is that the exception to the rule? It sounds like it's the norm.
It is the norm.
That's
From my
nice.
perspective, it is the norm because we're in very difficult business. We're in poverty alleviation. We will fail 100 times for every success. If it was easy to do, it would have been done in the last 65 years of the UN. But we are in that, you know, the UN is something that is dedicated to the highest of ideals of human behavior. And we more often than not fail to collectively uphold that and act accordingly. But it is a fascinating job. Every time it's a new, you know, it's international law, or you're looking at environment policy, or you're looking at gender, or you're looking at tax, you know, the way certain tax regimes have been negotiated through the International Trade Law Board or something like that. And so it's not boring.
No, but also you see, constructive criticism is also how people get to become better. For instance, in a university, if you're constantly delivering A's to people who don't deserve them, first of all, they think that they deserve the A, and they're not given the possibility to move from B to A. So, you know, also you have to see it that way. So they are in the business of delivering B's and C's as a way to aim for A, perhaps one day.
Yeah.
This was a positive way of putting it, that he's a tough professor.
Thank you so much, and I apologize again for having to leave.
Thank you.
Thank you.
My only fear, Chandi, is how our performance here at this event will be evaluated.
Well, you came.
We made it. Thank you so much.
So, thank you.
Isam will probably just do that.
Yes. See you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you for joining
Take
us.
care.
Okay, without further ado, I'd like to move on to Mr. Ralph Sewer's presentation. It takes a little bit of a shift away from the evaluation conversation we've been having, but surely as his role provides, he will be able to touch a little bit on his topic today to evaluation that we're speaking on. So, Mr. Rollins.
Thank you very much. I'm very happy to be here, and I appreciate that you decided to spend the afternoon with us. And just to recall that Jean-Marc and I go back almost 10 years, and I've had a wonderful experience of dealing with him even when he was head of UNU. So it's particularly pleasant to be here. Just wanted to say that when I was preparing for this talk, last night, I was wondering how I should go about it, and I thought that instead of looking at it from my point of view, I should try to put myself in your shoes and make a guess on something which might be relevant to you. And whether I have been successful or not, only you will be able to tell, but the perspective which I was trying to look at was from 2 points. That is, to ask really big questions. Why? Because the majority of this audience in this room is young. And when you're young, you have the opportunity, I think, to ask for big questions. Because the bigger question you ask, the more of an opportunity you have a bigger field of alternatives. So I looked at it from 2 points of view. One is, what's the physical world which you are going to be living in, which we are sharing right now? And obviously, because there's a difference in age cohort, you're going to be much longer lived than us. What's the world you're going to be living in? And the second question was, what are you going to be doing in your work? And to make a connection with international development. That's what I was trying to see. Next slide, please. So in terms of approaching the subject, I thought we'd look at some specific aspects of three thinkers. One is Adam Smith, Karl Marx, and Gandhi. The three thinkers are associated with very distinct political and economic styles and ways of organizing society. And these styles are well understood in the world. One of them is understood as laissez-faire, the other one is on the left. And these have become really synonyms for our political discourse. But for the benefit of the group of attendees, I thought I will try to introduce another person who's very well known, that is Gandhi, and see what his perspective is on this whole situation, looked at it from your point of view. Next slide, please. Methodology is a central question in evaluation. How you go about trying to find out is something which is as critical as the quality of the question which you ask. So here, the methodology which I propose to use out here is, what have been the effects of these ideas? And essentially take a realist point of view, just like when you go to a doctor and say, well, am I feeling better? You don't theorize about the doctor, you see whether the doctor has made you better. So I am trying to take a realist point of view. What has the philosophy of these people led to in our world? Next slide. Let's take first Adam Smith, very famous. Precisely the year when the United States became independent, 1776, he published an epochal book called An Inquiry into the Nature and Causes of the Wealth of Nations. And this is known as Invisible Hand of the Market. It's the favorite of the right-wing economics, in which he said, well, individual self-interest, as interpreted by the individual, nobody else, mind you, ladies and gentlemen, was the best for all. And his ideas paved the way for assembly line, and it was a division of labor. So consequently, hugely influential in terms of effectiveness, a massive success on the physical geography of the world. It transformed, this man's ideas transformed it. Next slide. What did he say? A very interesting quote. He says, it's not from the benevolence of the butcher, the brewer, or the baker that we can expect our dinner from, but from their regard to their own self-interest. And here, obviously, he is using self-interest as the motor of society to propel it towards development. And certainly we know that happened. Next slide.
I never understood what was meant by the benevolence of the butcher.
Benevolence.
What does it mean exactly?
Well, I think that you'll have to ask him. Yeah. Maybe he just
as
thought
a young
that,
man, I was trained as a butcher.
Maybe
I was always puzzled by this.
Maybe he thought
statement.
That a butcher might give you free meat.
Yeah.
Really?
But it's not the benevolence towards the animal, at least.
Yeah.
No, I was always puzzled.
So this is a very, very interesting point of view, and I thought that let's try to distinguish this self-interest thing from what Gandhi had to say. And here is the invisible hand, neutral. And you look at Gandhi, and he says, I must confess, I do not draw a sharp distinction between economics and ethics, which is a very, very sharp departure point from what Adam Smith said. And consequently, this is a useful point for contrasting the thoughts of the two men. Next one, please. Supply and demand, ladies and gentlemen, fundamental law of economics. Everybody knows about it. Supply of law and demand. The whole society dances to the tune. And Gandhi was not an academic writer. He was essentially a person who was in active life, expressing his ideas as he went along. And consequently, what he says is that the earth provides enough for every man's needs, but not for every man's greeds. And this is a very different, he is talking about demand. He is talking about what individuals decide to have for themselves. And he decides on a model of self-limitation instead of a model for your own self-interest. Next, please. Gandhi and supply, the other side of the question. He says, I would categorically state my conviction that the mania for mass production is responsible for the world crisis. Now, he was not a man who was ever shy of expressing his conviction right there and then. When I was reading up, I read Gandhi every day, and I was reading up and I was looking at his quotes on this, and I said, okay, this is really what encapsulates it, and he states that. Next slide. And here it is, I would like to make the connection to you, that is, as young people, the future that you face in employment. And he says, I am uncompromisingly against all destructive machinery, uncompromising. Dead machinery must not be pitted against the millions of living machines represented by the several 100,000 villages of India. Now here, he is, of course we know about the Luddites who were wary of the employment destroying potential of machinery. But here Gandhi comes out very clearly that there is a tension between them two, and he makes his moral point very clear. So questions, next one. So the questions before us are that what effect has the Adam Smith's ethically neutral model and mass-based production it led to had in the world and the world you will live in for the next 60 to 70 years? That's the question for you. And what have been the consequences of not living according to Leeds? We have two fundamental models. And that is one which is based on blind forces, and the other one which puts ethics in the side. Next slide. And the consequences, if you read the report of the International Panel on Climate Change, ladies and gentlemen, this is not what I'm saying. Overproduction and consumption of natural resources in the West has pushed environmental concerns to the forefront like never before, with the world changing for the worse before our very eyes. This is not my personal opinion. This is something which you can do an internet search and get about 500,000 hits on exactly what has happened as a result of this. Now mind you, I'm not saying that Adam Smith was not effective. What I started off with saying was, what are the unintended consequences? And here is the question for you as young people to ask, what are the unintended consequences of a model? That's because the answer you will get will depend upon the quality of your question. Next slide. The model itself remains untouched in the sense that they try for efficiency, but nobody tells you to consume less. JetBlue will, for instance, tell you that we are having more efficient planes, but they will not tell you that fly less. In no election will a public figure ever tell you that the time has come for people to consume less, that maybe a person should buy not 3 cars, and that maybe that you may not buy your 25th pair of shoes or your handbag. And consequently, it is something which is so ingrained in the public discourse that it needs really questioning. And I came across a site which said, there's a buy nothing day, and the buy nothing day essentially tells you, look, please don't buy anything, because you have become a kind of an automaton in which you have been enslaved into going into malls and buying things. Now, if you that's not really become popular because everybody likes to shop.
When is the buy nothing day?
You can, I think you can do this thing, but there is a buy nothing day.
It's the day after Thanksgiving when most people shop
Right.
extravagantly.
Right.
I see.
And
Big day of things.
the model for maintaining supply and demand has become so widespread that it is followed everywhere. It's being followed in India, it's being followed in China, and consequently, this is the question which you need to ask. Next, please. Now, coming to the other point, that is Gandhi's point of destroying employment for technology, this was for a long time a very controversial issue. They said, well, it's not really that. If you destroy jobs, you create jobs. And there were many studies that you don't have to be phobic about technology, and I understand that. But at the same time, if you have a look at, I was reading the study of Professor Eric Byrne-Jolfson and Andrew McAfee of the MIT, in which they said it's the technology which is now creating computer technology which is causing a dampening of creation of employment. And earlier, of course, as mechanization picks up, but now we are going into a completely different field in which this is going into fields like manufacturing, clerical, law, financial services. Algorithms will now do much of the work which involves discretion. And consequently, they're saying that the productivity and the employment, he calls it the great decoupling. And they are very famous people, and you can read that. Next slide, the Gandhian takeaway. That only thinking about your needs, as Adam Smith would advocate, has had huge unintended consequences. It is there for us to see. That the time has come that the international model does not blindly follow this model, but actually think about how societies can do with less material goods, and require less production and therefore do less harm to the environment. If you think it's a convincing argument, that the job dampening effects of new technology will have to be considered very carefully, as employment is essential to human dignity. And again, talking from Gandhi's point of view, he was an emotionally very intelligent person, always putting himself in the shoes of the unemployed, and consequently, what does the world look like to them? And he gave a lot of emphasis on employment. And the second point is technology for the sake of technology must be questioned. So, next slide. Gandhi was not against business. He was not a Marxist. He was not interested in expropriating society. He knew that businessmen are very smart, talented people. And what he was for, unequivocally, was for small business, village-based business, decentralized business, because according to him, that was something which guaranteed employment, that was something which gave meaning to work, meaning to people's life, and that is what the Gandhian model was. So the last slide, to sum up, ladies and gentlemen, my point of view, you may agree, may not agree. I think time has proven Gandhi right. And his economic ideas are not easy, but if practiced, highly effective. Through example and word, he was against relying on a self-centered instinct that Adam Smith advocated, of the need to limit our physical wants and of the tension between technological progress and its effects on employment. He insisted on the dignity of human beings through meaningful work. You cannot ignore his ideas in international development for the sake of you want to help and the life you want to live. Next slide. We'll talk about Mr. Marx next time. That's it.
Thank you, Rahul. Are there any questions for Rahul? He's, I think, also on a schedule.
No, I'm not actually. We are on the same schedule.
Okay, excellent. That's great.
We bicycle back.
Bicycling back to Manhattan.
Together, yes.
Yeah. Actually, you'll be pedaling and we'll be on the.
The only problem is that we have only one helmet.
Oh, then we have to take the train.
Yes. It's going to be a bit dangerous.
Okay, I actually do have a question for you. How has the Gandhian perspective on economic development intercepted the mainstream industrial development model that we see in Asia and that we see in Africa? What are some of the progresses?
Very little there, but what I see is some very interesting aspects of Gandhian thought coming here into the West. For example, as I said, there's this buy nothing day. People are trying, well, let's not really consume that much. He was a big one for local supply and demand. You see, it's becoming fashionable in New York to buy things from somewhere, which is a farm, which is only, not from across the country. And that would have would have got, Gandhi's approval, because it meant nearby, not shipping across the world. You have, of course, Goodwill stores, stores which sell, second-hand clothes. That obviously is something about sustainability. You have efficiency gains which they are trying to make. But again, as I said, nobody's telling people to consume less. What people are being told is that you consume, okay, as much as you want to, but it's just that we'll give it to you at a cheaper cost, at a better cost, that kind of thing. But people, remember, have started consuming less of things. I mean, they've shifted to smaller cars. That happened, a different thing, when the first oil shock hit. So can you trace it to a Gandhian, having a, this is Gandhian perspective and I'm doing that? No. But what I'm saying is that people have started realizing the common sense value of this advice automatically. They've started going into community farming. Very little of Gandhi's economics have in fact infiltrated into mainstream economics anywhere in the world, including in India.
But in a way, your whole presentation, how it connects with what I was ending on in terms of what's the value, for instance, of technical evaluation if it is not really pursued also in connection with thinking about the overall economic model in which we are functioning, because you are trying to improve practices, but what's the value of improving practices if overall the practices are bad and the policies are bad?
Actually, my notes are kind of along those same lines, and trying to tie these things together.
I think that would be a good segue then to move to our final speaker's presentation, Mr. Ihaluta.
Okay, thanks. You can go straight to the next one. So what I wanted to talk about, and first of all, let me say that these have been three very thought-provoking presentations, and not least Rahul's. And what I'm trying to, and I agree with all of them. But what I'll try to do is that what does this all mean to the evaluation profession in some ways, and I think that here are some of the messages that I want to bring up here. Is that we have to be very clear on what we are evaluating, and as as if I had talked with Jean-Marc, I put here with the big picture in mind, and this is not self-evident, because evaluations are often concerned with specific programs and projects and so forth, and people are looking into projects from the point of view that did they achieve what they set out to achieve, and exactly what you've been saying, that maybe the whole context is wrong, and I come from the environment point of view myself, and in the environment field we very much know this, what can be termed the micro-macro paradox, that you have a lot of good projects that are addressing global environmental issues, biodiversity. Lots of good projects that are supposed to reach their objectives. But still we are facing one of the largest extinction crises in not human history, but in the history of the Earth. Same, you get a lot of projects that deal with climate change mitigation. You have in transportation, in industry, in in energy and so forth, but still the greenhouse gas emissions are going up. So what are we talking about? So how does the evaluation profession deal with that kind of an issue? We all agree that everybody's got to be accountable, and like Jean-Marc was starting, that we are basically playing with other people's money. I mean, it's taxpayers' money, so we have to be accountable for the actions that we take, the interventions, the programs, and so forth. But what can we really be held accountable for? I'm going to come back to that. And to whom are we accountable? And I would argue that we are not only accountable to the taxpayers in the United States and Finland and France and wherever we may happen to come and who are funding these programs, but we are first and foremost accountable to the people on the ground where we are supposed to make a difference. And then I'll talk a little bit about what should and can be measured and so forth. So let's go. Well, we don't have much time, so let's skip these. But this was basically just to show that the environmental evaluation is a little bit challenging from many perspectives, and not least for the reason that the environmental phenomena have often different time and geographical scales than our programs and projects do have, which is basically a basic challenge for evaluation also. And you have a lot of uncertainties. You have climate change, which is putting a lot of non-linearities into the process, which is a challenge all the way through, from program planning to evaluation. You cannot anymore use the old norms of 100-year floods or whatever when you do your infrastructure projects. But so I wanted to take a very concrete example, which is the small grants program of the Global Environment Facility. And as it happens, we are conducting an evaluation of this program right now. It's a joint evaluation between our office and the independent office of the GEF.
And the GEF is part of the World Bank?
The GEF is a partnership. It's managed by the World Bank, but UNDP and other UN agencies are partners in this thing. And of course, this actually links back to what Rahul was talking about. The GEF was set up in connection with the Rio Earth Summit in 1992, basically to help developing countries to green their development, because they were saying, the developing countries were saying that fine, you guys want to save the whale and the rainforest and stop greenhouse gases. But it's our right is to develop, and economic growth is a right to us, and we don't care about this environment. You destroyed European environment 200 years ago when you were industrializing. Now it's our turn to do it to us. So it's basically a northern mechanism to transfer funds to make development greener, still without challenging the basic questions about the development model. But the small grants program is interesting because it's the only mechanism that GEF has to work with local communities. And it has funded 17,000 small projects since it was established in 1992, and in 120 countries. Something like $900 million have gone to these projects, but this, which sounds like a lot, but it's
in total.
In total. Mm-hmm. But most of the projects are in the range of $20,000 to $35,000. Okay. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So what do we evaluate here? The GEF established this project, their program, on the grounds that it will contribute to saving the global environment. So GEF has focal areas which include biodiversity conservation and sustainable use, climate change mitigation and adaptation, halting of land degradation, managing international waters and managing environmental chemicals. So the council of the GEF has basically set the program up to address these issues, and now wants us as evaluators to evaluate the 17,000 projects around the world in 120 countries, working with local communities against these criteria. Have they stopped biodiversity loss? Now, my argument here, and actually, I have to also make some advertisement for it, because I have a new book coming out on the 8th of May by Routledge called Evaluating Environment in International Development, in which I talk about these issues because they...
A very good book.
and there's a blurb on the back cover from Jean-Marc endorsing the book. So it's guaranteed good.
Yeah.
And I think it's important, and you are making quite serious assumptions here. And if I had more time, I would talk a lot about these assumptions, but $17,000, $20,000 projects in 120 countries, saving the global biodiversity. These are working with local communities. How do they come about? You have national coordinators in each of these 120 countries who scout the country for community initiatives and NGO initiatives and so on that do something good. In Samoa, there's a very successful small grants project. Just, again, $30,000, $40,000. There was a community, coastal community, they all are coastal communities in Samoa, more or less, which had depleted the coastal fisheries, and they were facing a problem that the fish were getting smaller and smaller and fewer, and they couldn't figure out what to do. So here comes in GEF and says, look, we give you money to set up a marine protected area around your coast, and you make sure that you don't fish there. Great. Now, the local community did it, the fish spawned there, and lo and behold, the fish population goes up. And because fish don't have very large brains, they don't stay there, they actually swim out and get fished. And the local community is very happy. Do you think that they did this project because they wanted to save the global biodiversity? No. But GEF funded it because they said that this saves the global biodiversity, in this case the fishery, and has now to report back to the council on this project alongside the 16,999 other similar projects, and try to add up how these projects save the global environment. Doesn't make much sense to me, actually, because even if you in a typical case you would say that you have a community that has been cutting down the forest, and making charcoal, and now with GEF help they do something else. They may have started a little ecotourism project or whatever. Okay, so in Mexico they work in this Yucatan mangrove area, and in Kenya they work in the semi-arid slopes of Mount Kenya, and and in Armenia they are in the coastal wetland somewhere. Even if you know, even if you can calculate that, with this you avoided 100,000 hectares of forest being cut, they are all very different ecological situations, and they have very different biodiversity values, and so it's kind of a meaningless to add these all up. The the SGP, the Small Grants Program, actually is the only GEF program that also has a explicit objective to help community well-being and livelihoods. And that's another thing that you actually probably can measure. And there are other dimensions that you may be able to evaluate. Replication and scaling up. You have these small projects and policy impact. In some cases, the government actually sees that, hey, this works, and and this is a win-win situation. These guys are actually having a better livelihood, and at the same time, environmental stresses are reduced. So let's change the policy so that we can encourage it elsewhere, and so on. But how far can you actually go and attribute these changes, and when you evaluate a project like the SGP projects, I argue that you would have to go to these replication and scaling up the policy impact levels. There are other unintended benefits. We always talk about unintended consequences and think about the negatives, but there are positives also. My colleague came back from Armenia yesterday, and she told about that the SGP projects there have actually halted urbanization, because some of the rural communities that were actually kind of devastated have actually been revitalized with SGP, and people are suddenly staying in their villages instead of moving to the town. An environment as an entry point. I mean, let's face it, we work in difficult countries, and many of these countries where we work are not model democracies as we would like to see them. And there's a lot of skepticism about NGOs and civil society and so on in many places. We have evidence that SGP environment is often seen as something that is politically less sensitive. So the fact that you have been able to, with the UN help and the GEF help, to mobilize civil society to work on the environmental processes, it has provided an entry point for civil society more broadly into policy making in the country. Not a mean feat. Again, evaluation point of view, we know this is happening, we hope this is happening, but it is nowhere in this documentation of the SGP as a target or a goal. So, is it legitimate for us then to, what do we evaluate against? So how do you go beyond just, collecting anecdotal evidence that this is happening and actually make it an accountability tool? So I guess, basically to sum up and is to, that working in very complex contexts and in contexts where you have multiple intervening factors and political context and economic, social, environmental contexts. But we have to try to evaluate and gauge what is the impact of these actions actually beyond the individual projects. Whether these projects that we have been funding are actually, reaching their stated objectives and so on. We have to go beyond that and try to keep the big picture in mind and try to capture these different ways they influence our world, or whether they do. sometimes they don't. They are just a drop in the ocean, a little thing, really nice thing, but a flash in the pan. But then, from an evaluation point of view, you have to struggle with issues like attribution and so on. How can you attribute these changes then to the projects and programs that you have been evaluating? And I've talked about it. What should be measured? Is it really meaningful in this case to measure, the little plots of land that have been not deforested? Note the negative way of saying plots of land that have not been deforested. So it's a counterfactual thinking already. Or is it, really to try to measure the bigger picture and say how have these projects actually been able to bring together improved livelihoods and people's well-being while developing, measured what can be measured, and so on. And in this kind of a case, I just put it here, it's my kind of a final point, is that monitoring and evaluation can be extremely expensive and laborious if you actually try to substantiate all of this with data. What the SGP is doing is that in 120 countries you have a national coordinator who is trying to keep track of everything that's happening in his or her country, based on self-reporting, based on hundreds of small projects, using a lot of effort and money and so on for this, and one wonders sometimes whether this is the best way to do it. We'll leave it at this. I have one more slide, but that's it. Okay, thanks.
Thank you. Does anyone have any questions?
One question so you end up your presentation with all the challenges, the methodological challenges,
yeah.
And because in the end it's all about data and modeling, right?
Mm.
So do you think that you are getting a better sense of the complexities that you are dealing with in terms of data and modeling as a way to improve the technical dimension of evaluation? Because it seems very complicated.
Yeah, it's very complicated and complex. If it were only complicated, it would be easier, but it's complex, and that makes it harder. The distinction being, like people say, is that complicated is that you have the bits and pieces. It's complicated to put together, but if you do it right, so the outcome is there. It's like sending a man to the moon, lots of difficult things to put together, but if you do it well, the man will be on the moon. But complex is when you know that there's lots of moving parts,
and they never stop moving,
and basically how you should do, but still, even if you do it perfectly, the outcome is uncertain, and there the analogy would be to raise a child. Mm-hmm. You do everything right, and there he goes breaking into the next parked car. But then anyway, so it's I'm very skeptical about these randomized controlled trials and quantitative experimental methods. They work when you have a narrowly defined project of one kind, which is addressing a fairly simple problem. But when you are working in this kind of a really complex, larger scale issue, I think you have to broaden your methods, and you have to really look into different kinds of data and different kinds of data collection methods and so forth.
But do you have the manpower to do this at UCP? Because it seems that your way to approach the matter is essentially qualitative.
Well, it's both, and you try to, and first of all, qualitative analysis can be rigorous also, yeah. Of course, but it's labor intensive often and so on. And so you have to choose your battles. But I think one of the important things is also that you have to, like you said in the beginning, so there, public money is scarce in the North, and there are ideological issues when people are, don't believe that the UN can ever do anything good anyway, and so on. I think you have to educate our governing bodies and the citizens about what is measurable in the first place. And it doesn't mean that you cannot, that you shouldn't be providing rigorous evidence of things that, and tests about what works and what doesn't. But in this case, for example, I think it's ludicrous, to be frank, to try to measure some of the things that the Governing Council of GEF wants us to measure. And you should educate them that, you should actually look at these other things which are actually more transformational than the direct benefits of.
Wouldn't you say that when it comes to evaluation at the global level and developing country, one of the challenges is the fact that you are dealing with a context in which there is no unity and homogeneity of agency. I mean, you have, in terms of the actors trying to improve the situation, you have the international organizations, the NGOs, the foundations, the governments, whoever.
Yeah.
And in terms of public policy, there is, while at the national level, when you are dealing with a government and a national polity which is functioning, you have a relatively homogeneity and unity and convergence of agency in terms of bringing about, development policies. And so, would you say that this is, since I think you are in planning and policy, I mean, do you think that it's part of the problem at the international level? I mean, all these projects, do they add up? I mean, all the actors, do they add up to?
Yeah, and right, and we've been talking. I mean, UNDP more broadly has a similar problem where it's trying to add up the results of number of very different kinds of projects and programs in very different contexts.
Yeah.
And in some ways, whatever, you can talk about elections, and UNDP says that, okay, so we successfully supported elections in 60 countries. Right, okay, so are these countries now democratic then, and are the people better off, and have they got more voice? You might have to accept the fact that you cannot aggregate things at the global level so easily.
Okay. Thank you very much for joining us today. Our time in this room is just about up, but we're also here, which is a great sign. We're going to move the conversation down to the lounge because we have to actually leave this room for the next class. So if you'd like to, panelists, please join us in the lounge before your scheduled departure. We'll be able to finish up the conversation and maybe we can talk in a more casual setting over some delicious sushi behind you, if you notice.